Well, my first slide will waste a couple of minutes because this was the title slide I made for another lecture, but I thought I would use that here.
That's nice.
You would think I have too much time on my hands. I'll put that together.
Awesome.
There we go. First thing I want to say is that so much of our examination is very subjective.
Mm-hmm.
So if Mrs. Jones gets water splashed in her right eye at the sewing factory, and she decides that she doesn't want to work in the sewing factory anymore, and she comes in and she just ain't going to read the 20-30 line, and she's going to be count fingers no matter what you say, she's going to be count fingers, right? And she may not want to read the color plates, and she may not want, when she does a visual field, she just ain't going to push the button, right? So, I mean, if she decides that she's not seeing out of that eye for whatever reason, everything we do is subjective, and if the patient's not cooperating, we're kind of stuck. There are very few things we have that are objective, and one of them is doing the relative afferent pupillary test. That's what we're going to talk about with pupils now, is using the pupillary response, the so-called Marcus gun response, to get an objective measure of the patient's vision. Because if Mrs. Jones, she can't fake the pupil test. She can do whatever she wants about all the subjective tests, but there either is or there isn't going to be a relative afferent pupillary defect. You can't hang everything on that, but that's pretty helpful. The only other things we have are the OKN drum. You spin the OKN drum or do the so-called mirror test. Patients can't resist that automatic reflex, and so that's a very objective way of checking whether or not a patient is truly NLP or count fingers. You may not be able to judge much more than that. But the point is, that's why the pupil test is so crucial, because it's like about the only absolute objective test we have. And it doesn't always help us, but it's pretty crucial. So first, the pupil itself. It's a balance of two mechanisms. First is the iris sphincter. And if you want to make the pupil small, you're going to design a muscle that kind of wraps around the pupil. And when you turn it on, it makes the pupil small. And the pupil constricts. And these circular muscles are segmentally innervated, and they're actually part of the parasympathetic system. So you may remember, sympathetic is fight or flight, right? If you walk into the first room, you see the first patient, and there's a grizzly bear there, you go, ah, and your pupil's going to get real big, right? And your hair's going to stand up. So that's sympathetic. So parasympathetic is the opposite. And so rather than making the pupil big, it makes it small. That's the response your pupil has when you try to read. Whenever you read, three things happen. Your eyes converge so you can see, and the lens focuses the light rays up close, and the pupil kind of gets small. So that's all parasympathetic. That's part of cranial nerve number 3. Number 3 is pretty busy. Remember, it has to steer the eyes, take care of the eyelid, and take care of the pupil as well. Now, the opposite is the dilator muscle. And this also makes sense. These are muscles that are radially situated. They're kind of anchored here at the iris root. So they're going to pull the iris open. And this, again, is part of the sympathetic response. Fight or flight response, pupil gets big. The thing is, it's not either or, because these two systems are active all the time. They're actually fighting each other the whole day, and they respond to everything. Of course, to lighting conditions, which is what we're going to talk about, but also just medications that are on board, and mainly mood and response. Even the plane of focus. So if somebody's focusing on your face up here, the pupils are going to be smaller. We're looking off in the distance. So this is a dynamic fight that goes on all day long. And the pupils are never really going to be the same size, for any length of time. They're always going to be dynamically changing. Now, another important response, we'll come back to this over and over again, is that normally the pupils are the same size as each other. So we're going to dismiss right now things that affect pupil size, the so-called efferent. So the efferent system is the motor system that steers the eyes and controls a number of different things. The afferent system is how well you see. And we're using the pupils to gauge the afferent system. That means we're going to use the pupils as like little light meters to tell us how each eye is relative to one another. So anyway, all this thing's going on, makes the pupils all different sizes, but they're the same size. But you know what I'm saying? So they're going like this, and they're going like this, and they're going like this, and they're going like this, all of us normally throughout the day. They're not going like this, not got one big and one small, but they're all doing the same dance all day long. I'll tell you why that's pretty crucial to understand here in just a minute. So the relative afferent pupillary defect is, again, using the pupils as a light meter, because when you put light in the eye, the pupil constricts. Turns out, if you put light just in the right eye, both pupils do the same dance. Pretty important concept, right? You put light just in the left eye, both pupils constrict. Not just the eye you're putting the light in. Now, a weird aside, and another lecture for another day, is certain animals, like even cats, aren't wired the same way. So if we put light in the right eye of a cat, the right pupil will get small, the left one maybe not quite as much. So they're wired differently, and birds are wired differently. But for us, for all clinical purposes, you put light in the right eye, both pupils constrict. Put light in the left eye, both pupils constrict. So we can use them as light meters. And the swinging flashlight test, as I said, objectively compares one eye to the other. I don't care what the patient's feeling. I don't care how many disability dollars they're going to get. If their eye is injured, they don't have any control over this unless they just slam their eye shut and won't let you even look in. So absolutely crucial, since it's really our only objective test that we can do. And I'm going to say this over and over again, in a normal, otherwise normal patient, both pupils are doing the exact same dance. So you could watch the pupil of either eye during the test. Now you already know the test, we're going to talk about it in more detail, but when you're swinging that light back and forth, you're looking at the eye that the light is on. Well, of course you would. That's the one you can see, right? But if it turned out that you couldn't, you can actually watch the other people. So a very common first-year resident mistake is, somebody comes to the emergency room and they've got a knife sticking through their eye, slicing through their iris. Their iris isn't going to move at all. And so you ask them to say, well, was there a relative afferent pupillary defect? They think it's a trick question. They say, well, I don't know, because he didn't even have an iris on one side. Doesn't matter. You can do the swinging flashlight test. And if you can see that one pupil in the dark, that's the challenge. You can swing the light back and forth and only watch that one pupil, and it's going to be an indicator of the swinging flashlight test, as if they had two intact irises. So both pupils do the same dance, so you can look at either one. It's just more convenient to look at the one you're shining the light in. But if you had a patient who had a fixed iris or a knife through their globe, and you really wanted to see if they had a relative afferent pupillary defect, you would still do the swinging flashlight test. But you have to be a little tricky trying to see that pupil in the dark. Sometimes you can hold another light sort of indirectly from below, so it's not casting too much light, and then you can actually watch that one pupil all during the test. All right, so when you go out and check pupils today, you check and make sure what I said is true, that when you put it in one eye, both pupils constrict. Now, there are patients that have other diseases where that's not true, but we're going to make that assumption today as far as checking for pupils. And the reason is that this is kind of a map of the eyes and the optic nerve and the chiasm, and this is a slice through the part of the brainstem that's responsible for generating this response. So the pupil light reflex is that the light comes in and it hits the retina. All right, the response in the retina through the optic nerves and through the optic tracts as it goes to the midbrain. And when it's in the midbrain, it actually has what we call a decussation. So there's actually a double decussation. So everything gets all mixed up and crossed up till you get to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And that's what sends the impulse out through the third cranial nerve to tell the pupil to constrict. But since it crosses twice, that's why in humans, both pupils do the same dance. Put light in just the right eye, both pupils constrict. Put light in just the left eye, both pupils constrict. They do the same dance. So let's look at the relative afferent pupillary test. So the patient's sitting in the chair, I have them sitting forward. We use the Finhoff transilluminator. It's about a 3-second swing, and it needs to be very fast. You can't just let the light just wander across the nose. I'll tell you why here in just a minute. And we're basically watching the constriction amplitude. It's mainly just that constriction part you're interested in. You don't really worry about release and all that kind of thing. You're just kind of watching the amplitude of the constriction when you swing the flashlight back and forth to each eye. The reason it's important that this swing be really fast is because not only is there an on response, so when you shine a light in an eye, there's an on response, boom, right, pupil constricts. When you take the light away, there actually is an off response that goes to both eyes. So if you take the light away, there's an off response that's generated. So if you swing the flashlight quickly from one eye to the next with little intervening time, you're stacking the on and the off responses on top of each other, which gives you even greater sensitivity. So that's why we actually swing the flashlight. That's why you don't just like put the light in one eye and say, okay, that's a 3-millimeter pupil. Okay, we'll give that eye 3 millimeters. Then you come over here and wait a few minutes, then you shine the other eye and say, oh, so that's a 3-millimeter pupil now too, so there must not be a relative afferent pupillary defect. That actually sort of works when patients have a profound vision loss in one eye, right? You can imagine that. Say somebody's blind in one eye, and you shine the light and just let it sit there for a few minutes and see how the pupils come down. Okay, then you wait a few minutes, then you put it in the other eye, and they won't come down quite as much. You might say, well, that test works great. But the way you make the swinging flashlight test, and the reason the swinging flashlight test is so sensitive, is by swinging that light rapidly from eye to eye, you stack an on response and an off response. And so it's going to really be extraordinarily sensitive. So that's why it's important that the light go quickly, so that you can actually get the biggest difference between the two pupillary constrictions to see if one pupil is abnormal or not. And again, that's the end result, right? What you're wanting to see is if the two eyes balance. And that's the big R in the RAPD, is it's only relative. So, one of my pet peeves with the residents, if I don't like them to say the patient had an APD, an afferent pupillary defect. I'm not really interested in the APD. I want to know the RAPD. I want to make sure that they've gone back and forth between both eyes, and they're telling me what one eye is relative to the other. Because you can have a relative afferent pupillary defect in this right eye. And what do we mean by that? As we'll see in a minute. You shine the light in this eye, both pupils constrict. Shine the light in this eye, they constrict, but not as much. Shine the light in this eye, both pupils constrict. Shine this eye, but not as much. Shine this eye, both pupils constrict. Shine this eye, not as much. Okay? So you say the patient has a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. Are their pupils the same size? Yeah, they are. They're the same size all through the test. It's just when you shine the light in this eye, you didn't get quite as much pupillary constriction. This one you got a lot. This one you got a little bit. So you say the patient has a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. So what does that mean? That means they may have an optic nerve problem or a retinal detachment. It doesn't tell you what. Is there something wrong with this? This eye's not getting quite as much light. So does that mean that if a patient doesn't have a relative afferent pupillary defect, they have healthy eyes? Well, what if both eyes have the same disease? So this patient has optic nerve problems in both eyes. So you do the swinging flashlight test, constricts, 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 constricts. So you say, well, that patient's good. Yeah, no relative afferent pupillary defect. They have two normal eyes. Not true. It just means that the two eyes are receiving the same amount of light. They could have bilateral disease. So that's one of the limitations of the test. It only tells you the difference. It's the relative afferent pupillary defect between two eyes. So for example, let's say a patient has optic nerve disease in this eye again. You do your swinging flashlight test. Both pupils constrict. Put it over here a little bit. Over here, constrict. Over here a little bit. And then they come back the next month, and you do the test and constricts and constricts and constricts. And you say, whoa, that's great. Oh, you're so much better, Ms. Jones. I'm so happy to hear it. She says, I'm not better. I've had a horrible month. Everything's terrible. And you scratch your head and say, hang on a minute. She had a relative afferent pupillary defect in her right eye a month ago. Now it's gone. It's better. And she says that she's worse. Does that make any sense? Well, it does, because her other eye went bad. So she had a good eye and a bad eye, and the pupillary test showed it. And then this eye went bad. Now they're even. Now there's no relative afferent pupillary defect, and she's worse. So the point is, it just tells you the difference between the two eyes. It doesn't tell you the health of either eye. And having a relative afferent pupillary defect go away might mean that the bad eye got better, but it might mean that the good eye got bad. All right? So that's the key, is that it's all a relative perception. So this shows a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. See, it constricts, dilates, constricts, dilates. And this is, basically a barn door relative afferent pupillary defect. And by that, I mean that when you put the light in the so-called bad eye, there's no constriction amplitude. It just dilates. Put it in the good eye. So anybody can see that one from across the room, right? That one's actually pretty obvious. And everyone would call that a relative afferent pupillary defect in the right eye, correct? But the ones that we sometimes miss are the ones where there actually still is a constriction, it's just not as much. And that's where we grade these, like from 1 to 4. So if a patient has a relative afferent pupillary defect that's mild, both pupils going to constrict no matter which eye the light's in, but just not as much. So you go to this eye and it constricts like this. Go to this eye and it constricts like this. This eye constricts like this. This eye constricts like this. That's still a relative afferent pupillary defect. All right, in the right eye, but it may be like a +1, or you might call it a +2. There's a situation where this eye doesn't respond to light at all. So this eye is stone cold blind. Stone cold blind. So you put the light in this eye and pupils constrict. Put the light in this eye and it's as if they were in the darkness. Put it in this eye, it constricts. This eye, it's as if they're in darkness. So that's where we use the word amaurotic. So that's called an amaurotic pupil, where this eye doesn't receive any light at all. Are the pupils the same size? They are. Yeah. They're big when the light's in this eye, and they're small when the light's in this eye. But they're still the same size. So when a patient comes in and this pupil's small, this pupil's big, that tells you absolutely nothing about how well they can see. That's a totally different lecture, all right, when they have an anisocoria. We're just assuming that there's no anisocoria and the pupils in the resting state are the same size, and when you do your swinging flashlight test, you can count on them being, giving you an answer.
It's 7:30 if anybody needs to go out.
Now, so this is how you do the test to optimize all those conditions so you can tell whether or not there's a relative afferent pupillary defect. You want to make it as dark as possible because you want the pupils to start as big as possible so you can get the biggest excursion when you move the light back and forth. You want to do it before they're bedazzled, all right? Before somebody's tried to do an indirect ophthalmoscopy, before dilation, and then you come in and try to do this test, they're all going to be bleached out. You want them to be equal. So we'll talk in a minute about patients who have had a patch on because of double vision, or somebody's already looked in their eye with a direct ophthalmoscope. The eyes have to kind of be equally dark adapted. You want them to look in the distance. Well, why is that? Because if they look up close, the pupils get small. You kind of messed up your test a little bit. So, and you want to use a bright light when you do the test, so the Finoff transilluminator seems to be about right. I think the indirect ophthalmoscope light's too bright, and some of our little pin lights that are losing their battery power, may not be bright enough. And I make the patient sit where I can see everything, all right? The patient's going to see you maybe 3 times a year at most, maybe once ever. So if they're a little uncomfortable, that's fine. You have to do this 20,000 times. So you don't want to be cramped and uncomfortable. Make them uncomfortable because you've got to keep working, for another 30 years. So you need to put them, so I try to keep them comfortable, but I want them where I can see it. So I tell them to sit forward in the chair. So they sit right forward, so they're like right there. I'm having them, look off in the distance, and I get where I can see the pupils up close, and I want to make them square with the wall. Because when you swing this flashlight back and forth, you need to be the same distance from both eyes. Because the light intensity that hits the eye falls by the square of the distance. So, if you're off even just like a ½ inch, that's a big deal. That's far less light getting in the eye. So that's why I set them all up and make sure it's nice and even, make sure it's all very regimented and scientific.
Do you turn off the projector light or leave it on?
No, I usually leave it on. It kind of depends. If you want to get it dark in these rooms, you have to turn the projector light off and you have to turn the computer screen off. I don't do that. If I'm really looking hard and it's really subtle, you can do that. But it's fine. Just turning the overhead lights off is should be sufficient. Rhythmic swings of the light, usually we say like 3 seconds. And it has to be pretty brisk in order to get that off response to stack up on top of the on response. And you're looking at the amplitude of the constriction, so it doesn't have to be bar and door before you call it. It can just be a difference in the constriction. And lots of swings, and this is where sometimes I don't do my job like I should. It really takes a bunch of, you can't just decide in 2, especially if it's there. You got to, a lot, by a lot I mean like 10, if you're looking really carefully for it. And then you can grade it, from 1 to 4. Or again, amerotic means that pupil doesn't respond to light at all. And you can actually check that later. So if you're doing the test and it constricts, and then dilates, and it constricts in this eye and then dilates in this eye, you go back later and you just shine a light in this eye, nothing happens. So this eye is covered up really bright. You put a light in this eye, nothing happens. So that's an amerotic pupil. So that it doesn't see any light at all. Does that mean that the pupil's stuck? No, the pupil moves. I can prove it. I put the light in this eye and it comes down like this. So it has nothing to do with the pupils being different sizes. You're using it as a light meter. Now this is something that you'll see some of the doctors do. You're welcome to do this too, is that especially for children, where you're trying to do the relative afferent pupillary test, or patients that have very dark eyes, all right, have very dark irides, it's very hard to see the pupil. If you're used to using the ophthalmoscope, you can take the ophthalmoscope from this far away, the direct ophthalmoscope, and make sure you dial in so you can actually see that beautiful round red reflex, because you can see the pupil beautifully no matter how dark the iris is with the red reflex. And you do that as the swinging flashlight test. Now it's not as bright as the Finoff transilluminator, but it works great. You can actually see the pupil constrict in this eye, constrict in this eye, constrict in this eye. So especially in kids where you can't get real close to them, or patients with dark irides, I'll sometimes pull out the direct ophthalmoscope to see if there's a relative afferent pupillary defect. All right, so the neutral density filters, let me tell you about it. I think there's probably not going to be an opportunity for you to use them. You're welcome to play with them, but just want to explain kind of what we do with that. So they come in different sizes, different densities, and these are the same that you would find at a camera store right? And it's a 0.3, and there's a 0.6, and they're 2.9s. And the numbers are worn off of them, so I usually have to lay them on the desk and look, and you can see which one is denser than the others. So just briefly to tell you why I bother to use them. So let's say you're doing the pupil test and you realize, all right, nice constriction a little bit, nice constriction a little bit. So you realize there's a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. I want to know how deep that defect is. So what I do is I dim the light in the good eye. So I put up a neutral density filter, so the light going to this eye is dimmer. And I do the afferent pupillary test again, all right? And I do it again, and this eye constricts for this one. Oh, there's still a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. So I put a more dense filter. So I make the light even dimmer to this eye. And the point is, I keep making the light in this eye dimmer until the relative afferent pupillary defect goes away. Now it's the same, all right? And then I can read off of this and say, all right, I used a 0.9 log unit filter to make the light in this eye dim to match the light in this eye, or match the response in this eye. So then I can say that the patient has a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye, right? But I can measure it by the filter I had to put over here. So I say they have a 0.9 log unit relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye. Say it's the right eye. So the filter is used to try to make the relative afferent pupillary defect go away by dimming the light in the good eye to the point that as far as the patient's eyes are concerned, it's seeing the same light and we get the same response. And it's just a way of measuring the depth of the relative afferent pupillary defect. So I don't have to say +3 or +4. I can say 0.6 log unit relative afferent pupillary defect in the right eye. And then you can actually measure that and see that change. You might see 1.2 log units or 1.8 log units. And that's just how much I had to dim the light in the good eye so that both eyes had the same pupillary response. All right? And again, you probably won't have opportunity to do that. If you've got extra time, you're welcome to play with it. But I suspect most of the faculty people wouldn't want you to mess with them just because it takes time to do. And most of them just want to get an idea whether or not there's a relative afferent pupillary defect. I'll actually use these filters to check to see if there even is an RAPD. And so this is advanced neuro, all right, 300 since you're here for the extra credit class. So let's say I'm doing the test, you know, and sometimes like in young people you have hippus, so you put a bright light in this eye, it goes, you put a bright light in this eye, it goes, you come here and it goes like this, you know, and it's just kind of hard to tell. So what I'll do, if I really have to know if there's an RAPD or not, I'll take one of the filters like the 0.3 or the 0.6 and put them in front of this eye. And I expect to make an RAPD. In fact, the way I made that video for you earlier was I snuck a filter up in front of that girl's eye and you couldn't see it, and I actually created an RAPD for you. She didn't have one because the light was dimmer. So I would expect to create an RAPD because I have a filter here and it's not getting as much light. So it constricts and maybe not as much, constricts and not as much. Then I put it on the other eye and see if I can get it to do just exactly the same thing. In other words, I created an RAPD in one eye, and I should be able to create it just as easily in the other eye. And if I can create an RAPD with a 0.3 in this eye, and I can turn around and create it in this eye, and there's no RAPD. I can be 100% sure of that. So that's why you'll see me use the filters sometimes even if there's not an RAPD. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, but just to explain kind of what that's all about. And this is using the filters. So I'm dimming the light in that eye, and see I'm actually creating a relative afferent pupillary defect. But the way I would use it in the clinic is I would dim the light in an eye in order to make an RAPD go away, and that would help me measure the depth of the RAPD. So there are a lot of things that this test sounds very simple, right? Very simple, but it's not, because patients aren't very simple. So if they have a big strabismus, they got one eye that's out here, it's really tricky because you got to get axial. Yeah, you got to get right in front of this eye. So you're putting it, you know, you're doing kind of doing this sort of thing. You know, you're kind of putting it right in front of this eye. Then you got to kind of catch that XT. This one, you got to catch that XT, and it's got to be about the same distance. So it becomes a little less scientific. So if the patient walks into my clinic and they've been wearing a pirate patch because they have a third nerve palsy, you can expect a relative afferent pupillary defect, right? But not in this eye. So the eye that's behind the patch gets dark adapted. It's getting very sensitive to light, very sensitive to light. You take the patch off, and then you do a swinging flashlight test, and you go, oh, they've got a relative afferent pupillary defect in their other eye. How did that happen? Hang on, they got, you know, a palsy nerve over here on this side, and they have double vision, and now they got an RAPD on this side. Well, that's terrible. Both eyes are affected. Well, all this happened, and I could make an RAPD in any of you right now. It would take me, 2 minutes. So if you did this for 1 minute, and then you took your hand away and we did a swinging flashlight test, you would have a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye, right? Because that one's kind of gotten light, gotten dark adapted under the patch, and it's gotten more sensitive to light. One eye blasted with light. So, after you've done slit lamps and all that kind of thing, sometimes it's a little bit hard. You have to let them sit for just a minute. And we talked about how hit this is just how the pupils kind of, especially young people, they're kind of like all over the place and it's hard to see. All right, so we haven't even talked about anisocoria except to say that we're not talking about it. And so that's when you start out in the resting state, the pupils are different sizes. Now that's a totally different reason. That could be a third nerve palsy or a Horner syndrome or an 80s pupil or iris neovascularization or trauma, or they've got iritis, or they got eye drops on board. So that's okay. You can still do a swinging flashlight test, and you can still look at the constriction amplitude, even though they're different sizes. And if one pupil is stuck, what can you do? You can just look at one pupil. Tricky, a little bit difficult to do, but you can just look at the one pupil if you have to. So a totally different lecture on anisocoria. And then another tricky one is unilateral cataract. So the pseudophakic in this eye, they've got a big, kind of almost white cataract in this eye. Well, it's not what you think. You put the light in this eye, that cataract acts like a perfect diffuser. It'll take that light and spread it evenly over the whole retina. The patient doesn't see very well. And it's not quite as effective in this eye because they've got a lens in their eye. So they will actually have a relative afferent pupillary defect in this eye because the cataract acts as a sort of a light amplifier. It just kind of takes the light and diffuses it all back against the retina. So it's not unusual to see a small relative afferent pupillary defect in a patient who's pseudophakic in one eye has cataract in the other. But it's pretty small and usually doesn't kind of reach the level of clinical importance. So anyway, the whole reason we do it is to compare one eye to the other, and we don't know why. And it doesn't tell you whether it's optic neuritis. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. It just tells you that there's something different between the two eyes. And that's an important piece of information to start with because it's the only thing that's entirely objective. And no matter how that patient feels, no matter how determined they are for the doctor to sign their disability form, I don't mean to sound cynical, but and no matter how much they don't want to read the chart for you, you can't fake the relative afferent pupillary defect test. But what it tells you is somewhat limited, but it's very important information.